Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley and I'm joined by James Marcus Tucker, who started the original One+One magazine from which Exploding Appendix has evolved.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, so I think we should probably start your first podcast by talking a little bit about One+One and where Exploding Appendix has sort of come from, if you like. I mean, it hasn't come from One+One per se, but I mean, it's the background, I suppose, to the kind of work you're doing and what you're writing and your interests sort of stem a little bit from what you were doing on One+One.
Well, I think it's also going to be a site which archives all the One+One stuff, and I think it's sort of developing on from a lot of the stuff that happened.
Yeah.
So I think One+One was obviously set up as a kind of filmmakers. Well, in fact, it was actually grew out of Brighton Filmmakers Coalition, so it was a kind of practical group of people that were making films at the time, and it kind of sort of developed in quite, I don't know, it wasn't an easy kind of clear trajectory. It was kind of a growth that kind of explored lots of different avenues, and I think over the 5 years from 2009 when it was set up till 2014 and then maybe 2015, things really sort of shifted and changed in quite drastic ways, I think.
It was a group of people that were very much aligned in many ways, their interest in cinema, underground film, European cinema and so on, but also had very different views or different ways of exploring these ideas. So there was the queer angle, there was the Marxist angle, there was the counterculture angle, so there was quite a lot of different voices, weren't there, in what we were doing, that were kind of, they felt very aligned, but at the same time they weren't all coming from exactly the same place.
Yeah, I think it was always exploring. I think there was an explorative feel, I think, from the get-go. Things were often going off in quite different directions, so you'd have some, I think we were very excited, I think in 2011, for example, about, Occupy or the Arab Spring and all those kind of things kind of shifted, I think, in that year. I think things really changed.
So I love that kind of mixture of cinema, politics, culture.
Well, I think it was one of the good things is you look at a film. Well, for me, one of the things I would look at a film and I think, how can I use this to kind of talk about issues that were going on around me and things that were going on. So there was a kind of for example, when I was reading Mary Poppins and looking at, sort of the Tory government's big society, things like this, flexibility in the workplace, play in the workplace, how does this relate to Mary Poppins, just a spoonful of sugar attitude? Yeah. So I think for me that was one of the things I think from One+One was using film to try and think about issues that were going on outside of those films, or to apply these films as if they were kind of lenses to explore the world.
I love the way in which you kind of came from it from a very sort of anti-political correctness point of view, and I think is that something you're still, because maybe we should talk about that then, because I think political correctness is a hot topic at the moment, and there seems to be a bit of a backlash against political correctness. But what I like about the way you did that was that you didn't do that from a kind of libertarian right perspective. You still did it from a perhaps Marxist perspective, or
Yeah, I think one of the things that has always struck me, certainly growing up at a time when New Labour kind of went very much rightwards, but rightwards in a very, very kind of progressive way, or in inverted commas, progressive way, in the sense that on the one hand you'd have kind of much more conservative economics, much closer to moving more in the direction of Thatcher in the privatisation, but it was an attempt more to appeal to a kind of left-leaning liberal voter. So it's a kind of there became a kind of political correctness which was quite different from something you might have got in the 60s, in the sense that, for example, if you look at Malcolm X says that, the root problem of racism is land. In Labour, with New Labour, it seemed much more like the root problem of racism was language. So the thing was about changing language, not changing the ownership of land. So that there was a less structural. The Macpherson inquiry seemed to very much focus on, although it talked about institutional racism, that institutional racism came down a lot to attitudes. So it was much more about how people were thinking and having prejudice, and and so it became much more personal. Even if they were talking about institutional racism, that institutional racism came down to personal attitudes, much more than something like in the past had happened with some people like Malcolm X and the more kind of structural analysis of racism. So I think there was a big shift. And so you got something that you might call a different kind of right kind of began to emerge. But I think this has been going, I think if you go back to Walt Disney, in the 1950s, he was very much with the McCarthyists, Red Scare, paranoia. In the 1960s, he brought out a fairground ride, It's a Small World After All, multicultural, sing-along, blah, 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 but very much a kind of symbolic gesture. Douglas Broder likes to say that there's a link between Disney and the 60s, that Disney was kind of paving the way for the 60s, but there's a kind of big difference between a lot of people that were doing much more structural analysis to the kind of symbolic kind of everyone holding hands. I think has been a shift so it's not just New Labour it's kind of been a long thing that's sort of developed. But it's certainly a type of right, I think, which that aligns really with progress. And the kind of the blackmail for anyone on the left is if you don't side with this, when you're going to end up siding with the right, the really scary right. So that threat of, say, your Farages, your kind of
your EDLs,
the fear of that is meant to make you align with the progressive right. So there's a kind of, I think, trying to do radical politics today really gives us a challenge.
Yeah.
Because the challenge is, how can you do radical politics without either aligning with those two sides?
Yes.
And that takes a lot of kind of thinking, and it's a difficult thing. And I think one of the problems is that political correctness can just make us actually align with the progressive right, the prog right. And I think that is actually a serious danger as well. It's not that just becomes a kind of ideological halo for kind of austerity and all the other things. So I think that's, although of course I think there's a lot of libertarian critiques of political correctness. And I think some of them are actually really worth paying attention to.
Of course,
insightful. But I also think there's also that Marxist critique that's worth paying attention to.
I think it's so important though, isn't it? Because what I'm worried about is, just in terms of what you're doing or going to be doing with Exploding Appendix, and one of the things I hope that it's able to kind of challenge is that libertarian side of the kind of or the right, the alt-right critique of political correctness. Is that something that you think the left is not doing very well, or do you know what I mean?
I don't think that they're doing it very well at the moment. I think there are ambiguities between what is a kind of cultural libertarianism at the moment and what is actually the alt-right. And I think that there actually are, for example, in the case of Spiked has its roots in a kind of revolutionary communist tradition.
Because you wouldn't get that from reading it today, would you? I wouldn't have. I wouldn't. I didn't know that, you see, because I've read Spiked and I wouldn't have known that.
I mean, I think clearly there are times where Brendan O'Neill clearly wants to distance himself from someone like Donald Trump, and obviously say that Donald Trump is as much doing identity politics as the politically correct crowd. So the identity politics that he's doing, of course, being kind of white victimhood rather than this other stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So I think Brendan O'Neill was quite good, actually, I think, on that issue, showing that there's actually something palindromic about the two. And although you'll find these moments in Spiked where they talk about green austerity, so they're criticising austerity on some level, I always feel that they don't quite push the socialist angle as much as I feel that I'd like them to.
You'd like to see, yeah.
So
is that something that, in terms of your writing then for One+One and now going forward into Exploding Appendix, that socialist angle into political correctness, culture, counterculture, and so on?
Well, I think one of the things I value about counterculture, and I think the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, for example, is that I think it did something. It was ambiguous. I think there were certain parts of that culture which actually did take us down this route of kind of etiquette policing. I don't agree with that. But I think there were also other things that were going on in the 60s and 70s which were really about shocking, challenging people, about free speech. There was lots of things that were actually about making people think. And I think, for me, a lot of the films I really like, John Waters films, the Coquettes, the Kusha brothers, all those kind of people. And on the other hand, a lot of the kind of blaxploitation cinema was actually really challenging, thought-provoking stuff. So that is kind of a tradition that I kind of want to kind of resuscitate, because I think it's actually a way of approaching political correctness without kind of going towards this kind of, we want to go back to the 1950s or whatever.
Yeah.
It's actually a much more subversive way of approaching it.
Yeah.
And also, quite often John Waters films are a kind of queer, they're quite kind of queer cinema,
Yeah.
but they're not the kind of queer cinema that's going to go tiptoeing around an issue. There's a real fuck you attitude to them.
Yeah. I watched recently Visconti's The Damned. It was made in, I don't know what year, in the 70s, and there was some of the scenes, it's just sort of gay Nazis, sort of orgies and all kinds of stuff, and I just thought, wow, like the kind of stuff that he was showing and he was creating, you'd think they would never make something like that today. They would be too afraid. He was doing stuff that was going to probably annoy some people.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think, there are directors that, I think Lars von Trier actually is a director that I think is always provocative and thought-provoking. You can never quite tell what he's actually saying, but there's always something that's going to provoke me to actually really think and engage with him. I think Todd Solondz is another director.
Yeah.
I think we're going back, but Fassbinder, I think, is a director that really sort of makes me have to think dynamically around the left-right divide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I often tend to think that, although they might not always come on the conventional left perspective, they tend to be, these are films that I think are really useful from a kind of emancipatory perspective, but they're not necessarily ones that will be conventionally left.
No. Why is it so difficult today? Why do you think that the left has gone so heavily down this political correctness route? Why do you think that it's so sectarian? Like people like Peter Tatchell, for example, who, he's someone who's not afraid to say things, and he gets lambasted for it. He gets called a racist, he gets called all kinds of things because he dares to challenge certain ideas. Just on a slightly similar note, Milo Yiannopoulos, gay right-winger, British guy, moved to America, loves Trump and all that. Yet he said that the real subversives, the real counterculturals today are conservatives. The point he's making is that it's actually conservatives who are saying things that are actually shaking the dominant narrative now. Like to say you're pro-gay marriage is not subversive. Yeah. To say you're not pro-gay marriage is actually quite subversive today. So it's interesting how that flip's happened.
Yeah.
And
Well, I would say that there's been a shift. I mean, since Thatcher's sort of decimation of the unions and neoliberalism more generally, that we've lost a kind of conventional, traditional left. So the left kind of, as far as I see it, split into two. So on the one hand, part of the left kind of went towards the centre economically, but they adopted kind of progressive stances, more culturally emphasised rather than structurally analysed, more personal rather than social. And then there's another group of people, a kind of disillusioned working class, that went more to the right, but with but because they saw a kind of almost socialist kind of gleam on what was actually largely a kind of right-wing nationalist kind of movement. So the kind of left has been kind of absorbed largely in that setting. Being disempowered, I think what they've tended towards doing is the left, anything that seems left has to kind of opt for where their power is. And the power often means aligning with the progressives. And where do they get most of their traction? With the kind of progressive right, or the kind of the centrist kind of sort of Blairite kind of positions. The places where they get most power is on identity politics, sort of feminism, gay rights, race, but on a cultural level. So because that's where they get the most traction, that's where they can push most. And the way they can push most is usually by kind of aligning themselves and drawing on those powers to actually help them. And that usually involves drawing on those powers to censor things for them, because I think that's basically the only way that power really works for them a lot of the time. So the kind of alliance that works there it's kind of drawn from actually being disempowered. I think, ironically, if you empowered the left more, you would actually have a much more politically incorrect left.
Right.
I think one of the consequences of having a disempowered left is, in fact, that the left becomes much more outraged, politically correct, kind of. That I think it's a point of being weak, and it's a defensive move a lot of the time rather than an offensive move.
That's a really interesting point. They're always trying to stifle dissent or stifle anything that might be considered dangerous, rather than proactively, positively contributing something of their own into the cultural space, if you like.
I think it is seriously dangerous in this respect. For example, we take a lot of the trans issues at the moment. Safe spaces are usually described as kind of defending trans people. The reason we need safe spaces, the argument goes, is because it defends trans people and they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
But they only defend the people that are trans and agree with the dominant trans narrative. If you're a trans person and you like Jermaine Greer, or if you don't agree with the dominant trans narrative, you're more vulnerable. Not less vulnerable, you're more vulnerable.
Yeah.
So if you're a trans person that doesn't agree with the dominant practice, you become more vulnerable. And I think this means that rather than safe spaces serving to protect trans people, it serves to police trans identity. And it actually serves the right as a way to keep trans people under the thumb. And I think that's the real danger at the moment.
So you think that's happened because of a disempowerment?
I think that is largely disempowered because the left's real only option is to side with the kind of progressive right, the centrist politics, with kind of Blairites, with Hillary Clinton. That need to kind of align with those people pushes a kind of politics which doesn't give you that many options, and the options that it gives you are ones which are much more cultural. They're much more they're going to be about how do we police culture, how do we police etiquette, and that's the thing that kind of tends to emerge.
What are they afraid is going to happen? These people that want to police language, what are they afraid is going to happen if they don't do that? If they allow people they don't like or whose opinions they don't like, if they allow them to speak, what's going to happen? Like, are we going to go back to 1930s fascism?
Well, I think it's almost like in the recent referendum, obviously the scary person is the Farages, the far right. So, and obviously serious threats. So the fact that they're there often pushes you to then align with the centre-right Europhiles. And having those tensions actually makes a very awkward position. So you can understand why people might want to say, look, I don't like the far right, I don't like the hard right, I really want to move somewhere else. But then that often then means you're aligning yourself with a kind of neoliberal austerity programme with some sort of progressive flourish on the top. So it's really, I think there's a really difficult dilemma to be faced with. And I think part of the way we approach this dilemma is not necessarily to say, oh look, there's going to be an easy answer to it. Part of it does mean just actually really working out how to think about this without having to immediately leap to the sort of the prog right, let's call them, but all the the centrist, austerity driven, with a kind of gay marriage on top,
gay marriage cherry on top. Okay, so I guess you don't have much truck with identity politics in general. Then I think we should be really careful here actually to make a distinction. Talking about race is not a bad thing. Dealing with gender politics, sexual politics is not a bad thing. I think what's problematic is when it becomes, where the identity is the thing that functions here. So the civil rights movements, I think, have had many good things going for them. Expansion of the democratic ideal, so it can appeal to kind of gay people, black people, etc. That's not a problem for me. What my problem is the way that identity ends up policing how we engage with each other, dividing people, excluding people from the kind of frame. And this, I think one of the things I like to make a distinction between is labels and identities. Sometimes the argument is that labels are bad because they're kind of forced on you. Identities are good because it's your choice.
It comes from
within.
Yeah, it comes from within. I think we should also look at it the opposite way around. So the dilemma for me is labels are often very easy to contest. If I say, well, you're straight or you're gay or whatever, you can discuss it with me as a label. Is this the good label? If you look at the fridge and you find your tomato sauce has Tabasco sauce written on it, you can change the label. It's a label. It can be changed, right? Identities kind of have a kind of subjective attachment. So because of that, it's really hard to challenge someone when they say, "This is who I am." We should note that German nationalism didn't in Nazi Germany wasn't a label. It was being part of the Aryan race wasn't a label. It was an identity. It was something you really clung to. Being white in America during slavery was not about a label. It was as an identity. It was something that binded you. And by binding you, it excluded another group of people.
Yes.
And I think that's what's really scary about identity. I think is the way it binds a group of people together and excludes another group of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we should always be very cautious of taking identity too seriously.
And also, it's dangerous because it's going back a little bit to what you were saying about, say, like trans politics and so on, and safe spaces. That if you don't behave how you're, expected to behave because of your identity and so on, then
so it ends up policing your identity.
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing. It gives you a kind of blueprint about how you should act.
Do you think we should? So how do you deal with that then? Because for example, Judith Butler said that identity politics was very important at one point because it was important, for example, for gay rights. How do you get gay rights if you don't at least say, well, I'm gay? Do you know what I mean? How do you, unless you identify with something, you can't use it to progress?
I think it's not going to be a case of we're not going to talk about who we are, who we culturally are, what we might call, to make a distinction, I think we should certainly be talking about personal politics, but existential politics. So we should talk about, and this is going to try and make a distinction between, say, existential politics of gay rights, and identity politics of gay rights. So I think it seems that we do need to be talking about existential issues, personal issues, sort of our own sort of stories, people's stories. That seems very different than what would be really bad about identity politics, the way it binds people to a group and all those kind of things. So I think we do need something like existential politics, existential trans politics, blah, 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 blah. But that's going to be quite different, I think, from...
Well, the standard like for example, LGBT politics or something, which puts everybody into that box or into those identities or however you want to... Yeah. Okay, so with this site, Exploding Appendix, obviously podcasts, videos... What kind of videos and podcasts are you going to be doing?
Well, so I'm been working on my own Bradley show, which is hopefully going to be a really creative, experimental show. Because I think I don't think this is just about politics. I think it's about, I really value innovation and creativity. And I think I want to live in a society that's not just about having justice, equality. I want a society that also has freedom, creative expression, exploration, creative ideas, things that look good. Even design and all those kind of things are really important. I don't want a kind of
you don't want the stifled kind of culture because
well, in fact, it's not even. I don't want a stifled culture, but I also want a culture which is constantly challenging itself, innovating. Although right-wing libertarians are often given the credit for this, entrepreneurialism is a really good thing, right?
Yeah.
And we should be fostering it, and we want a society where people are setting up projects, doing things that are creative. And I think that's really, really important. On the one hand, the state has often had an important role in entrepreneurialism, and I think that's really important. But I also think there's a real importance of not having everything centralised into one power. It's really good to have, say, for example, you might have worker co-ops or other kind of associations in civil society that experiment, and they're not everything being kind of simply run by the state.
Yeah. But isn't that partly also what was so great about, for example, sort of 70s filmmaking like John Waters and sort of trash cinema or Derek Jarman and all this, is that they weren't like worried about applying for funding from the Film Council or whatever it happened to be at the time. They went out and they made the films, and they weren't trying to be politically correct. They weren't trying to tick box quotas. They weren't, they were just like, this is the stuff we want to do, and we go out and we do it, and we create a group of people, of like-minded individuals.
Yeah.
It was autonomous culture in a way.
So it's, I suppose in some sense this kind of comes from the kind of libertarian communist and the anarchist kind of tradition, but of building, rather than building things from the state, building lots of little pockets in sort of civil society that kind of that are run egalitarianly. So there are limits with this, of course, if you've got lots of little things in little pockets in society, it's sometimes really hard to bring them together, build kind of power and change society. So often they need something more than simply those little pockets. But on the other hand, there is a real benefit from sort of building things outside of the state, because it doesn't become this kind of single...
top-down, vertical kind of approach.
Yeah.
But isn't that hard, though? I mean, one of the things, isn't that more difficult today than it was maybe in the 70s? I mean, entrepreneurialism, as you were saying, the dominant kind of capitalist culture means that entrepreneurs tend to work towards trying to make money, make profit, and if they don't do that, they kind of do something else to make money. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people that might want to go out and form groups and create films or write whatever, they still have to pay their bills, they still have to work. Do you know what I mean? So is it people today who want to create interesting culture, they apply to the Arts Council, they apply to these sort of state-run institutions because it's the only way they can do it in order to survive, in order to create that work.
Well, also, yes, and I think that's true, and I don't think you can have those things simply popping up on their own. One of the reasons they popped up, or they were coming up in the 60s and 70s, is because you had, after the war, a stronger welfare state. So you had ways of actually not being so dependent on getting a job or getting employment. Yeah. So that you could develop your kind of co-op or your little commune.
It was cheaper to live as well. It was cheaper to buy, food was cheaper, everything was cheaper.
We can't just say, oh, let's build lots of co-ops, and because that's not going to happen unless you have things going up on state power happening up above as well.
So for you, it still depends on there being a kind of state welfare
protection. I don't think that you're not going to get one without the other. There's going to be, it'll be hard to have one without the other.
But isn't therefore that the difference then between your perspective and, say, a libertarian rightist perspective on this idea of culture, where you might say, okay, we have some areas where we agree maybe on political correctness, blah, 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 but at the same time, they're not willing to say, let's have that welfare state that can enable this culture to flourish.
I don't think, in practice, libertarianism produces great entrepreneurialism. It's often a struggle. I mean, if you look at something like The Fountainhead, it's actually, it seems like someone like Harold Rourke is really there. His journey is a struggle, right? The only reason his entrepreneurialism isn't really compatible with a lot of things that go on in capitalism. His spirit is obviously he's in favour of the free market, but he seems very much to be struggling to survive, and he seems to be dependent on people, other people recognising him and discovering him. And so actually it seems to me that story is quite a common story. I don't think that entrepreneurialism is fostered by having big companies out there with lots of money. That means that most entrepreneurs are not going to, most self-interested individuals that are creatively innovating things in the kind of Ayn Rand sense are not going to meet their potential.
No.
So ironically, I think, although capitalism is often seen as the kind of pinnacle of innovation, I'm suspicious that it actually really
well, because to me there are certain people who are willing to take risks and bet their mortgages on their first feature film or whatever, but very few people are able to do that. It seems to, I would argue, it stifles risk taking in a way. The kind of capitalist system. If you take the welfare, if you take that bedrock away, then people are not willing to take the risks because they're too worried about making sure they can feed their family or whatever. So you need that kind of underpinning, don't you? I
think so. And that's why one of the arguments for basic income, of course, is that it
was recently voted down, by the way, in Switzerland. They had a vote for it, but anyway.
Yes, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, but no, I think it also has that potential to allow people to actually spend time working on innovations and.
Because isn't it about potential? Like for me, it's like the thing about capitalism that really pisses me off is all that human potential that goes. And I'm not just talking about in this country. I'm talking about in Africa. I'm talking about really poor countries around the world. The millions of people who could have cured cancer by now, but simply because they haven't had the that ability to take risks and the ability to actually thrive. You have to create the situation in which people can do those things. They're not just going to be able to do it.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that the libertarians seem to get right is, greed is kind of good. Greed is good if everyone was able to be greedy and to really kind of to innovate and do things for themselves and have that kind of luxury that everybody really quite often wants, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to be living in some kind of austerity kind of driven kind of...
No.
We don't want kind of some sort of religious asceticism. I don't think that's particularly healthy. So I think we do want something like luxury. We want kind of some concept of greed, but it's certainly not a greed that the right would kind of understand. Not as the right would understand it. I mean greed in this sense as something that would greed for everyone. Something where we can all kind of push our own potentials and drive things for ourselves, but for other people as well.
Is there not a different way of saying that rather than is greed the wrong word then? Maybe there's a different desire,
you might
striving, I don't know, just something else other than greed.
Maybe. I mean, but also there's something about that word that's also evocative. One of the things that I think the yuppies kind of got right in a way was that kind of their rejection of the sort of guilt of wanting to have things for themselves.
Yeah.
So I just think they channeled it in the wrong way, right? There is something correct, I think, in not wanting to kind of say, oh, it's bad that you want to live in that nice house. And
of course.
Actually, there is something good about that. Of course you want to
live in a nice house. Yeah.
So actually, we should be saying, we want to reclaim that. And we want to reclaim it for everyone as something that would be structurally different in a society that would be structurally different.
But the trouble is, of course, those people that want the nice house, the problem is, of course, that they're focusing on their own greed and getting those things without trying to change the situation around them.
Yeah.
Where that would be enabled for everyone, or that could be offered out to everyone. That's the problem, isn't it?
I think there is a question about this because if you watch Game of Thrones, one of the interesting things about Game of Thrones is that no one really benefits, even the people at the top, because obviously there's a contestation of power. But if you're the king, you're not going to live long.
No.
And that's, if you're not the king, you're also not going to live long. But the part of that
your power has always been contested. You don't know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. You don't know who's going to usurp you, whatever.
And I think, although that in our society that doesn't always happen as extreme, if you're in a boarding school, the sort of abuses that might go on in boarding school, the sort of hazing you might get in boarding schools is one way. I mean, traditionally, I think there's been much more arranged marriages within the wealthy because it's a way of controlling and keeping money.
Of course, yeah.
So it's not always obvious that actually the wealthiest people actually genuinely do benefit from such a society.
They have their own trappings.
They can have their own trappings, yeah.
Absolutely. What do you mean by freedom when you talk about for you? You said one of the important things for you was sort of in terms of culture and work, and it was freedom. But that means so many different things to different people because an American Republican uses that word, a communist uses that word. What does that mean?
Well, I think for me, freedom has to have some context about what it is. So if freedom simply means freedom from a particular institution, that doesn't tell you much about the quality of your life. So I think we do need to think about freedom in relation to something like flourishing. What's the function of this freedom? So I suppose there are two questions. I mean, sometimes on principles, we should say, look, we're going to fight for this because it's a violation of our freedom of speech or something like that. We might simply do it on principles. But there are other times where we might say, simply just describing things like this as freedom, without describing the kind of quality of freedom, the quality of flourishing that we might have as an individual, I think that is a problem. And I think that's one of the problems with the defences of capitalism, when capitalism is simply described as a freedom from the state. It's not simply described as a way in which it allows you the freedom to do certain things, or the freedom. For most people, it doesn't give you freedom to do things. If freedom means freedom to starve or freedom to be in an oppressive employment or an exploitative employment, that doesn't seem much of a freedom. I think we have to also describe what type of quality that freedom has and what freedoms what enables you to do. So yes, being free from repressive state institutions is important. It's important to defend democracy. It's important to defend freedom of speech and all these other things, but they're not the only factors that make freedom. And I think we do sometimes tend to have these kind of abstract phrases like equality and freedom and stuff that we can kind of use without really trying to think about what kind of quality of life we're talking about. So, you know, equality can be really good, but if equality simply means we're all miserable, but we're all equally miserable, that's not really a good thing.
Yeah. That's, some people say that's the gay marriage. Everybody has the right to be equally miserable. So you're doing, go back a little bit. So you're doing podcasts. You're going to do these videos, these Bradley Show videos, which will be more sort of kind of like visual essays on.
Yeah, I think I've been just enjoying the opportunity to be as playful as I want, really. And I mean, we'll see how much it works. I think it's going to be a bit of a trial and error thing, partly because it is so creative. I'm just kind of going for it on that respect.
But you'll be doing them on sort of films.
On films.
Yeah. Talking about like critiques of films or explorations of what the films are.
Of what the sort of films are exploring. Sometimes I'm sort of taking the films from slightly odd angles, but I think you can. One of the things I really love about films actually is that they can be really illuminating, right? So you watch one film and you get this idea. So it's almost, you see the world through this lens, and then suddenly you come watch another film and you see it from a different lens.
Yeah.
And one of the good things is actually if you keep watching these different films, although they're taking from different perspectives, you start to sort of accumulate a kind of an interesting way of conceptualizing a kind of an issue. And I think that's one of the things I really like about films, actually. They kind of give me a way of seeing a particular from a particular angle, a particular issue. And so although you might kind of watch one film and it almost has the opposite position that you've just argued for in the last film, what's kind of good is that they kind of help you think through quite different perspectives and help you think through where you stand on these things. And I think that's one of the things I really like about film. I mean, obviously, I assume it applies to literature and other things as well, so it's not simply film. But film, I think, for me, has often been a really good way of having a lens to think through different issues from different perspectives.
Would you say films have... Has a movie, a film, I'm going to put you on the spot here, has a film ever made you change your mind about the perspective, about an issue, say, or a political position, or is there something you watched and thought, wow, that's sort of... I've never thought of it in that way before. I
think there's a lot. I mean, I've always been really... I always thought Dogville was a really powerful film, right? Because it's... I'm not sure it completely changes my mind. I mean, a lot of these things, I don't think you sit and watch a film and think, oh my God, I converted to a new position.
Yeah.
What they do is they kind of really challenge the way you conceptualise these things. I think there's a lot of films that do that. And they're quite challenging and controversial. Dogville's being obviously one, there's others. I think storytelling has always been one that I think challenged me, especially the first story, and that is a really challenging story. I mean, there's other films that I think don't kind of work the same, but like Pink Flamingos for me was always a kind of symbolic film. It always represented a kind of attitude. And that was a kind of attitude of, yes, we're in favour of equality or diversity or whatever you want to, but it's with a real fuck you. So it's not a real fuck off kind of attitude. So it's not this kind of nice, sort of politically correct, nice.
Not appealing to the wider audience to agree or...
Yeah, it's like you either like us or you don't. I think that's one of the things, and we don't really care. You know, that's one of the things I quite like about that sort of thing. So yeah, the films have kind of had some sort of... They kind of existentially kind of... One of the interesting things, of course, you always see films through your own lens as well. So they're not complete. There's always a sort of dialogue between you and what's been created. So it's not exactly like the film is going to be me simply experiencing someone else's perspective. But there's always something else going on, and they can introduce kind of new lenses to think about things. So one of the things I do like to do is sometimes I like writing an essay where you look at a number of different films, and then you use these films to take you in different places and actually try and be relatively true to that film, and then go off to the next one, and you see the tensions and differences from your own position. Because I don't personally think, oh, I've got one particular position and I'm only going to stick to that. There's a lot of the time film, especially watching loads of films together, makes you think, well, I agree with you there, but there's also a counter argument that comes from here, and if you watch this film, then so it's not as easy as simply saying, oh, there's one singular position that we need to. There's not one dogma that we're going to kind of completely kind of stick to.
Is all your work mostly going to be about film with Exploding Appendix? Is it?
I see it as culture generally, but well, I said that to somebody and they said, "Oh, that sounds really broad," especially because politics, for me, is also part of culture. Science is also part of culture in its own way, and I think part of my own interests are very much culture in a sense of how these different discourses emerge and how the tensions and how these different ideologies emerge within our kind of cultural frame. So that's quite a big topic. But I think what unites, or what shouldn't unite Exploding Appendix is really a kind of attitude that kind of brings that culture together. So it's not, oh, anything can kind of go in here. But yes, I could have a piece on theatre one week and then a piece on science the next week. What's going to unite them is the attitude, not the attitude and maybe the way it explores the ideas and maybe some of the ideas it explores, but not a sense that there is one kind of genre or discipline that's going to be the focus. That's where it shifts from, I think, One+One, because we were mainly talking about film.
Yeah.
Or if we expanded out, film was still the kind of focus.
It was, yeah.
But we were using other things maybe via film. Or talking about things via film. So I think we did that all the time, actually. We talked about things that are outside of the film.
Yeah.
But film was still the focus and it sort of framed everything. Whereas I think Exploding Appendix will be somewhat different in that respect. Maybe I would like to actually ask you a question, actually.
Okay.
Because I just wondered what you feel about, because you've been part of this in your own ways, in many different ways, since its inception, since 2009. So you've kind of come along. I wonder what your story. You've just asked me mainly about my story because I'm sort of setting up this Exploding Appendix. But where do you see kind of this trajectory? How do you understand this trajectory and the changes that have happened over the last 6 or 7 years?
What's exciting about what you're doing is that it is so, the word that you've used, syncretic, and there's so much scope for what it can be. Yeah, so I don't know really. I want to see what happens. I'm really fascinated by how things have changed so much since 2009 politically, where we've gone. It always felt much more, rather than just sort of standard kind of left-wing Marxist critique, because I always thought of it as Marxist, but it was much more punky in a way, wasn't it? Like the attitude to cinema, 70s cinema. The people we liked were not sort of dry academic kind of...
I think there was a kind of Marxism in it, but I think it was certainly a very punky kind of countercultural Marxism. Yeah. It wasn't a kind of a sort of dry kind of that kind of image of a kind of Marxist that's just concerned with the politics and getting the equality. And I think that wasn't the kind of image of...
No, exactly, and that's what I liked about it. It wasn't sort of partisan in that way, or party political or anything like that. So I still want to write on issues, sort of, if you like, queer issues. That still really interests me, and I want to. One of the things that's been on the back of my mind is Fox and His Friends by Fassbinder, talking about issues of, because I'm still fascinated by the issues of class and sexuality. So, the LGBT rights movement and how so much of that has been a kind of middle class kind of movement, and so I want to engage.
When you say queer, maybe you could just define it, because I've noticed for myself what I understood as queer when I was growing up seems to have even changed in public understanding of that. So maybe
of the word queer.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I have a very. I find it confusing, the word queer, because to me, at one point, it's sort of anti-identity. And Lee Edelman, a writer I really admire, he always uses the word queer to mean sort of anti-identity and anti-anything that's considered normal. So anything that's considered the kind of the canon, or considered sort of established or acceptable within day-to-day life. If something challenges at that, then he would use the word queer. Yeah. But then I also think that queer has also become perhaps an identity in of itself. People just use the word queer when they really just mean gay. Like gay men. So I think for me, when queer cinema would be, a cinema that isn't just dealing with the themes of gay people, queer, trans people, whatever, but that it actually does it in a way that's different or from the mainstream. So the way it's presented, I would think about Derek Drummond's A Garden would be a typical example of that. I would say perhaps John Waters' films are queer in that way.
Do you think they're more subversive? Is subversive the
right
word?
Queer would have to be subversive, but then the problem with that, of course, is then you'd have to say somebody who's arguing against gay marriage is queer, you know, or because that's subversive.
Or is it that also there's a type of subversion which is sort of
there's an emancipatory subversion, and that to me is it. I think if I want to use the word queer, it would have to be that. It would have to be emancipatory subversion that was not just a repackaged conservatism or a repackaged.
So not any imp will do. It's got to be an imp that that's actually an imp that's doing something for some kind of universal good. Or
absolutely,
something.
Because you know they with the Tea Party they consider themselves a revolutionary, but their philosophy is old as the hills. You know, it's still an exclusionary. They're still fighting for just more of the same. But to me, it just feels a bit more of a crueler version of the same.
Okay.
You know, it's not emancipatory in any way. It's not actually going to bring freedom. It might, for example, reduce people's taxes, but then I don't consider that to be a particular freedom. Do you know what I mean? And it probably wouldn't. You know, and I think that's the thing for me. So yeah, I think against equality, you could argue would be queer. The Tea Party are not queer. But again, I don't know. I'm not saying that with any particular kind of authority. I'm still open to this, but it's just that's kind of what I would mean. Whereas I don't think a movie that was let's say Milk, about Harvey Milk, was a queer film. It was a lovely film about the particular gay rights movement at the time. But as a film, I wouldn't say it was queer. It was quite establishment. It was made by established, acceptable filmmakers in a very classical American Hollywood style. It wasn't subverting anything at all, was it?
I mean, you could argue that it's a film that's about somebody that was standing up for rights.
Yeah.
That's inspiring for people that are.
It's a brilliant film. Yeah.
And what my point here would be, isn't this? You could argue that this is like somebody that's quite radical in the sense that they're standing up for gay rights. Isn't there something potentially subversive in showing something like that, or is that not subversive anymore?
It's not subversive anymore because it's coming from a place where the dominant ideology, certainly in the West, is that of course you have gay marriage or you have gay rights. So in a way, it wasn't a subversive experience to watch the film. It wasn't. It
would only be if it included some other issue that.
Yeah,
if it used that and then applied some other issues. So if for example, it was about a gay communist, that might be
that.
Is that where you kind
maybe
of
yes? If it was about a gay communist and it was actually trying to introduce ideas of communism, within the gay rights movement, then you could argue that it had a sort of subversive element. But I don't think there was a subversive element, say, in Milk. There was nothing. I didn't come out of the. I came out of the film going, oh, how beautifully shot that was, and what a great performance that was. But I didn't feel like anything had been challenged by it, but it didn't need to. I mean, that wasn't the purpose of it. Therefore, it didn't fail for that reason. It's not a failed film. No. It's just that's not what that film was.
Yeah.
So again, like you, I'm interested in films that actually challenge, because for example, Fox and His Friends challenged the attitudes of gay people at that time, and how they treated each other, and how the class structures and inequalities within gay culture was as oppressive, as the wider bourgeois culture of the time. So that's kind of the why I want to engage with films more like that. But I mean, there could be, for example, I can't remember whether this is the case, but you could say there was something in Harvey Milk's. His representation of his sexuality, for example, like he, who he slept with, or the kind of sex life that gay men have. Like, there's still something subversive, I think, in films that, like, for example, okay, here's one, Queer as Folk, the TV series, I thought was subversive because it presented gay men as sexual beings. It didn't just present them as, right, let's show gay men to be safe and just like you and me. It kind of said, yeah, they fuck, they have sex, they have sex in toilet cubicles in their lunch hour. The main character is a 15-year-old boy, and this adult had sex with him. And again, they wouldn't make that today.
So it didn't try to turn them into kind of nice, wholesome, conservative gay men.
Yeah, and I think that was subversive even in the late 90s. And even if they showed it today, if they had made it today, it would still be subversive today, I would feel, because it's uncomfortable as a gay man to see other gay men doing things on screen that you would go, oh, you know, that he's not being a good person there. And that comes from, and this comes a little bit back to, does it? I was going to say a little bit about the political correctness thing, you know, about being politically correct, because people don't want, they're so afraid that a negative representation of something or somebody, supposedly a member of a particular identity group, you know, showing them up to be human, almost like showing them up to be flawed is dangerous. It's sort of, do you know what I mean? Yeah. So, and that was always the thing I loved about Queer as Folk, because I just thought they didn't care about that. And he wrote scripts about real life and flawed people, and so that's subversive to me. Just actually showing, in this age of identity politics and political correctness, showing characters that aren't acting, you know, quote unquote, you know, good, can be a very subversive thing.
Yeah, but it's also, I think one of the things, it does show up sometimes that a lot of things that seem politically correct are actually about creating a kind of wholesome, conservative vision of that kind of group.
Exactly.
It's not necessarily something that's positive.
No, that's it. I think political correctness does do that. It's actually very conservative in that way. So good luck with it, with Exploding Appendix. And I look forward to seeing what new podcasts and videos and articles come.
Yeah. Thank you.